Sometimes I forget to do that, and Zoom always punishes me. But yeah, why don't we get started?
Great.
Awesome. So thank you everyone for coming or tuning in if you are listening after the event. We are so excited to have Uday Kumar. Uh, Uday is a cardiac electrophysiologist by training. He's the founder of iRhythm Technologies, a leading digital healthcare company focused on cardiac rhythm diagnosis. His recent startup, Element Science, raised $150 million in their Series C funding round. Uday, thanks so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here. Yeah, I think, I guess unless you had some sort of introductory remarks,
No.
I guess we could kick it off with the questions.
Yeah. So you want to go with the questions, or want me to just read them out, or?
Yeah, I'm happy to read the questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess firstly, if you could talk a little bit about your background
Yeah.
and why you wanted to start Element Science in particular.
Sure. So I was a Harvard class of '94, so quite a while ago. I was a biochem molecular bio major. I was very interested in lots of different aspects of science, and it might sound weird, but back when I think you guys are still semesters, right? So, but imagine in 4 years I took 44 classes. I took a
Wow.
lot. I learned a lot. So I got a wide range of things trying to figure out what I wanted to do, particularly on the science side. And so then I was at HMS for med school. That's where I really started thinking about the intersection of technology and healthcare. I'd always thought I would be interested in ophthalmology or other things. I'd done my undergrad research thesis at Mass General East in Charlestown. But when I got to kind of med school, and this was in the 90s, mid to late 90s, there was a lot more focus on the business side of healthcare and my interest in technology. So long and short of it is most of the stuff I did in med school was related to the later stage of developing technologies, the clinical trials and all of that. But I knew I didn't have any experience. I had gone straight through college and med school, wrote a thesis that was more molecular in nature. And so I really wanted to understand, like, is this kind of just the grass is greener on the other side? I knew I was probably going to do residency. So I actually took a year off after med school and with some friends started a company called Biomedical Modeling. We were doing 3D printing of CAT scan and MRI data. This was 22 years ago, for planning complex surgeries. And it was a way for us to really for me to understand, how do you get technologies into the healthcare sector? How do you introduce them? How do you work? So it was a great experience. And I encourage people that if you think about being an entrepreneur, you think about doing something different, you have to go and try somewhere, do some sort of an experiment, do some sort of something. Otherwise, it's just theoretical. And so how do you work that in somewhere? But that gave me a good grounding that I really like this, but I don't have any experience in being a technologist or an entrepreneur or any expertise. So I said, well, I'm going to go back to medicine. And so I realized by that time, I really like cardiology, the intersection, a lot of cardiac diseases are all technology driven. So I went back to residency with the aim of really progressing fast. And long and short of it is I did my residency at Columbia and I short tracked in 2 years and I came out to California. So I've been in California since 2001. I went to UCSF for my medical training. And part of the reason was come to the Bay Area where a lot of healthcare startups come from. There's also a fair number in Boston, but those are on the more biotech. When you really think about medical engineering and health technologies around the Bay Area. So it was an intentional move. So another thing I would tell young entrepreneurs or young people thinking about this is I live life by a series of probabilities. So if you want, so sometimes I give the example that starting a company is not easy. You maybe have 1 in 1,000 people in the US can start one. Maybe 1 in 100 in the Bay Area can start one. Maybe at Stanford, it's 5 in 100. So it's still super hard, but you've increased your odds by putting yourself in positions and in environments where there's other entrepreneurs, other support structures, other stuff going on. And so one of my thoughts was to do that. That's why I moved out here, even though I'm a New Englander originally from Rhode Island. So that's how I got out here. And then why I kind of thought about, merging the two. And then after I finished my medical training, and I, like you said, I was a cardiac electrophysiologist. That's a mixture of people who treat abnormal heart rhythms with a lot of technology, a lot of tools, defibrillators, ablation catheters, et cetera. I went to a program called Stanford Biodesign, which was in its 5th year. It's a bioengineering school, which really teaches how do you think about unmet medical needs, and how do you think about the problem, and then figure out how to solve it in the best way. I've been on faculty in bioengineering there for the last 15 years after I finished, and I always spend a day teaching and doing other things, and I can talk about that later. But I spun out my first, well, not my first, since I did biomedical modeling, but my first real company, iRhythm, from that. That was a company really bringing the intersection of wearables, machine learning, and kind of human factors engineering together back in the late 2000s, 2006, 7. So that's where it started in terms of this journey. And then I can keep going on those to get the element science if you want. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
I guess before we go down that path, though, I'm really curious about what you said about sort of maximizing probabilities at each stage. Do you think that's something that you live your whole life by? Would you recommend that for young entrepreneurs? And how do you sort of think about that in your life today, I guess, as opposed to back then when you were deciding what to do?
Yeah. I mean, I think I probably was more. I was maybe more thoughtful than others early in my life. Kind of once I figured out kind of what I wanted to do, I kind of thought about like, well, how do I get there? How do I do that? How do I give myself the best chance? Because it's really hard. I mean, I knew that from my experience. And again, being at Harvard, that biomedical modeling company was a function of people I knew at MIT who we did this together, and we kind of like did stuff at MIT's 50K competition. It's probably 100K or 150K now. I don't know what it is, but it's like gone up. But trying to get those experiences along the way to understand how this process occurs. So like with everything, they're just pieces of data. And so, but they're objective pieces of data, not subjective, because again, it's very easy to only look at success stories, and you don't really know until you start doing it yourself. And so I think that idea of just thinking about risk. I mean, there was a really good New Yorker article years ago about entrepreneurship. And successful entrepreneurs are not those who take risks, they take calculated odds. Meaning like you're actually not just rolling the dice, hoping it all works. You've actually thought through it. And especially serial entrepreneurs like me, you really think about what does it take to make a venture or an idea successful. It's not just willing it. Again, that happens. But by and large, as many of you know, most companies don't go anywhere, 99%. So how do you think about putting yourself to give yourself, like I said, going from a 1 in 1,000 to 5 in 100, it's still hard, but it's a logarithmic order improved set of odds. And so just thinking about those things as you make choices about like what courses to take. Again, I wouldn't be too crazy about it, but at a high level, just doing those back of the envelope calculations, I always do. Whenever people present to me the company about something, I like to do quick mental math about just thinking about things in relatives. So you kind of can just use that data to make good choices based on risk.
Yeah, I mean, that's super interesting, especially in sort of a space where it seems like, at least on the outside looking in, that it seems to be very random and sort of people do things because it's what excites them in the moment, as opposed to taking that calculated risk. So really appreciate you.
And I'll say like one of the things about what we teach at biodesign is really thinking about the problem before you fall in love with a solution. Really understand all of the things. I can't tell you how many young entrepreneurs I meet either at Stanford or otherwise who are very excited about what they're doing, but they have a hard time articulating why is this problem really worth solving? Why do other people care? Why would someone pay for it? Really get that. And again, you have to have enthusiasm. All of that's really important, but you want to be objective. And so again, thinking about and that probability is just another piece of data along the axis of objectivity. Because if you have that, you probably be able to think about your emotional feelings towards your idea or the work in a way that helps make good decisions. And I think the other thing I would say is, you also want to. One of the other things I learned along the way is when I started iRhythm, I went to a lot of entrepreneurs I knew who were very successful at Stanford, who started many significant medical device companies and technologies. And unlike most entrepreneurs, I wanted to tell them, like, tell me why this is going to fail. Just kill it for me, because I'd much rather know now about something you might know than find out after wasting 2 or 3 years of my life. Most entrepreneurs don't want to hear those things. They don't want to hear why it's bad or what's going to be challenging. They really want to hear why this is the next, best thing to slice bread. But you really want to get that feedback, because if you can then understand those risks of what this project would entail from people who should care about you and they're just giving you good advice, then you can put that into context like, okay, are these risks I can mitigate? or are they risk? I mean, what we teach a lot at Stanford, what I teach a lot about is risk. And most projects are a series of distributed risks, and you want to understand how those risks are in sequence. And upfront, what are those risks up front? Because for instance, let's say the first thing is a scientific risk or a proof of concept engineering prototype risk. But let's say you're a physician or someone from business and you don't know anything about it, but you don't have any partners. There's a mismatch there, meaning like, how are you going to mitigate this risk if this is the key risk? And that's the first thing that people want to see before they give you money. So again, it's not saying it's not possible, but it's just allowing you to make relative choices and a relative understanding about different pathways, which may or may not make sense.
No, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think we can
Yeah,
dive more into the weeds of what exactly you are doing at Element Science.
yeah.
Obviously, the wearable space is one that is oftentimes talked about, and you see it in TechCrunch, you see it everywhere. I guess firstly, what's it like working on the ground and
Yeah.
creating a literal wearable product, and how is that different from what you were doing over at iRhythm?
Yeah, so I mean, I have to talk about iRhythm to get the element because so after
For
I
sure.
finished my time at Stanford Biodesign, what we do is called needs finding. So I took some time off after that summer of '06 to really go back and think about like, were there other unmet needs in the cardiac EP space? That's where I kind of saw some literature and did some of my own research about this, that there was really not a great way that if someone has a heart attack or someone has something called heart failure and they've been in the hospital when they go home, their heart, as it heals in the first 1 to 3 months, is at risk for going into a lethal arrhythmia that could kill someone and lead to sudden death. Like you see people on TV or whatever, they collapse and people come with a defibrillator. That's sudden death due to a lethal arrhythmia. So I said, what can we do about this? And I came up with this idea of taking an AED, like the things you see on hospitals and airports, and putting it into a sticker patch to basically have a self-worn defibrillator adhered while you go around. Now, at that point in my career, another thing I think is really important for young entrepreneurs to think about is like, where are you in your career, and what is feasible and what's realistically not feasible? And again, a lot of what I'm talking about within the healthcare space which is very cost incentive, regulatory reimbursement. It's maybe different in tech, but health tech, med tech has different. So there is some real pragmatism that you have to think about. So at that point in my career, building a defibrillator, and this was before iPhone 1. iPhone 1 came out in 2007. And so when I thought about all the technologies, how big you could make it, it would have been a very challenging product. And at my point in my career, when I was just turned like 30 or 30, I finished all my training, I was in my early 30s. I'd done something before, but how was I raised the amount of money for something like that? That would have been a much bigger project. So there was an example of really interesting patent, really interesting insight. No one had thought about it. The company that was doing something similar, wearing something like a vest, was just starting to make money. They do about 800 million in business today. So it's a really good market opportunity, but it wasn't where I was in terms of what my knowledge was and what I could convince investors. That's something also that you have to be very objective about. What are your strengths and weaknesses, and where are you in your career? Because you could keep going and saying, why don't people give me money? Everyone says it's a good idea. It's not that. It might be like, are you represent a team or someone who can mitigate risk? So I put that patent aside, said I'm going to pursue it. And then I went back to one of the ideas at Stanford, which was iRhythm, which was also, I thought, challenging, but not as challenging. Like I said, I went to ask people, why would this suck? Tell me why. Kill it now. They said, no, this would be what I remember one mentor saying, this is a varsity challenge. It's like, it would be hard, but you could do it. And so I kind of thought about what were the risks, particularly for me. I was a domain expert in the field. It's arrhythmias, abnormal heart rhythms. I kind of knew the engineering, what needed to be done, but I never built a company to that scale. So I had to find a partner. So as I was going around fundraising, one of my risk mitigations was, could I attract a person and a team? And so I basically got to the point where I had money lined up to close a Series A of 12.5 million. So, in a very short period of time, but I also was in parallel bringing together other people to help mitigate the overall risk. So that company started in my apartment here in San Francisco. And I remember my first notebook, my first thing was like, buy a printer. So like that's how these things start. And so anyways, that company, it's just down the street here in San Francisco. I can see it from here 2 blocks away from where I'm in Element. But that company is now about 1,500 people. It's been as high as $8 billion market cap. It's about 4 billion now. We've done about 3 million patients. So it's a real product that's changing that industry of how people get cardiac rhythm monitored. So anyways, I learned a lot there about like, how do you build companies? A lot of stuff. But as we were getting to about 2011, 12, and the reality was the next few years were just about the knife fights with payers to get more data to convince them. All the docs I was talking to like, oh, we'll use the product, just come back when we can get reimbursed. And so I realized like, I want to go back, and my patent for the defibrillator had just been issued. So I said, oh, this is a good time. And I got a little sidetracked. Third Rock Ventures is a venture firm in Boston, based in Boston and here. And I knew some of the folks there, and they said, hey, maybe you can come help us think about medical devices. They did some in diagnostics. Mostly they were biotech. They're just based on Newbury Street. So anyways, I took a little detour there, but they built companies internally. And so they and Google Ventures, who I knew from iRhythm, they funded Element Science because they saw the market opportunity and also kind of where wearables going. And so this company got kicked off in 2013. The first Series A was about 40 million, and then we closed the Series C of 150 or 145 million last year in March. But, and again, we're building a wearable defibrillator, so it's a wearable therapeutic. So iRhythm was a wearable diagnostic. So this is like the next gen, if you will, of very much more complicated electromechanical project, much higher order of risk, but a huge market opportunity. And COVID has just accelerated everything, because our ultimate thesis was most patients would much rather get cared for at home. And now we're building a therapeutic to keep people out of the hospital, to basically monitor them and shock them are they about to die. And COVID just showed everyone, yeah, I would much rather not go to the hospital if I can be cared for at home. So I think our thesis has just been jump-started even further than we knew it was going to happen. So that's kind of where we are. But Element's story, and in terms of our ability to build this product, is kind of what I was saying earlier about timing. In 2013, miniaturization due to smartphones, advancements in ML, a lot of those things have been happening now for 5, 7, 8 years. And so the product we're building now would not have been possible when I filed the original patent, but it was possible in 13 and 14. And then based on my experience and success and learning from iRhythm, I had more street cred, if you will, to be able to basically raise large amounts of money from very like blue chip VCs, et cetera, and kind of take it to the next level. So, you know, all of those things go back to what I was saying before. Whatever you do first, you also want to make sure it's because if you can get some wins up front, it makes a huge difference later. So if you go for the big grand slam up front, and I was very fortunate, iRhythm turned out to be a grand slam, but if you turned out, but I didn't mean it to be, it was just the right fit for where I was and the type of technology and my experience set. And that's why probability thinking and relative weighting really matters early in your career, or throughout, but more so early.
Absolutely, and appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, kind of still in this sort of probability, area. I guess I'm curious, what has been your experience with VCs and fundraising? You've obviously found a lot of success in fundraising. I'm sure everyone watching can say. But do you think it's also sort of this probability game when it comes to raising money for whatever round it might be? And yeah, how has that experience been for you?
Yeah, so so raising money is always hard, even for success. It's always hard. So let's just say that it's not easy. It's always easy in hindsight, but it's very hard along the way. And I've started some other companies too as co-founder, but iRhythm and Element, I've been sole founder, so I've been the one pounding the payment and doing all these things. But so I'll say in terms of VCs, I think the first thing that a lot of founders or entrepreneurs don't do is get educated about what type of companies various entities fund. Do they fund things like you? Do they fund entrepreneurs with your set of background? Do they fund things in your industry? Like how much do they put to a company? And do you really understand how much will be required for your company over time? So for instance, if you go to a small VC and you have $100 million, a project that's going to take $100 million or plus, they may not be a good fit because they're going to maybe only invest a few million total, but they're going to maybe get diluted down to nothing over time. And so you want to start understanding, well, how much do I really need to get to a liquidity event, customers, patients, whatever it might be, work backwards and then find out who are the VCs that kind of play in that space for your industry, your amount of funding, et cetera. That will cut the universe down to those who are more highly probable of being a good fit for you versus getting set, again, not always perfect. Again, it's just relative. Then among those, you should figure out, do you have any ins with those? Like, do you have people, do you know of other companies they funded? Do you know other people? Can you cold call those companies? Like, what did why do you like these investors? Why do you not? A lot of it's just Google and pounding the pavement and picking up the phone and doing your homework. It doesn't cost anything. It's just a lot of work, and you don't know where it'll go. So I think those are ways you increase the probability that you can focus on entities and investors. The other thing is what I kind of alluded to, but it's very important, is trying to understand how big your market is and how big it, really is not like it could be, but what it is today, how much money it would take there. For instance, if the total addressable market for a product is, let's say, $200 million, you can't build a company with 100 million for a $200 million market. It's just not, no one's gonna, there's no liquidity there. But if it's a $200 million market and you're able to figure out a pathway to get to some sort of sustainability or something that's meaningful with 20 million, then you start to think about, oh, that's a, 1/10 of the total addressable market. Maybe someone would buy the company then for some multiple of that. So you then can think about, well, you got to make sure that what you're raising is appropriate for what you would need over time to get to a point where someone could buy the company, you can go public, whatever, and it is supported by the market. So a lot of this is a lot of what we teach at Biodesign too for our medical entrepreneurs, but it's true for anything. Like, what do you think it could be? And so that you're not barking up the wrong tree. So, like for the defibrillator company, I went to very large VCs who invest a lot of money, Google, GV, and Third Rock in a particular round. Why is that? Because I knew there's a lot more to come after, and I wanted to make sure I had a strong syndicate who could continue to participate or would be able to attract bigger. And so when I raised the Series C, the lead was Deerfield, which does a lot of healthcare, and they also do IPOs, so they could also help in the next phase after that. So as you just think about these things, you just have to get smart and talk to other people who've done it before, try to understand so that you just picking. But that being said, you still have to have a good story, and it goes back to what I said earlier. You need to be able to quickly articulate why your problem's compelling, why your solution makes sense, and why there's a value proposition. And in the healthcare space, both clinically as well as health economically, which then could drive a sustainable business.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I appreciate the color there. I guess I'm curious, how do you think, obviously addressing young entrepreneurs, how do you think they should address or sort of weigh the sort of technical benefit or technical expertise that an investor might be able to provide versus just the long-term, as you alluded to, funding and sort of just supply of cash that might be available at a big firm, compared as opposed to little.
Yeah. So I think, there's money and then there's smart money. And so I really, for the most part, not always, but most of the time, I've had very much valued the input from the investors I've had because they've been well versed in the space. A lot that happens in the med device and health tech space, digital healthcare as well, is that oftentimes young entrepreneurs will look at the tech world and then see like crazy valuations and crazy funding rounds with very minimal dilution. You're like, but that doesn't typically help in healthcare. So whenever I look at thinking about investing myself or looking at other companies, I look to see if a company in this space has talked to healthcare investors who know how it really goes. If they've talked to them and those people haven't invested, but they're able to get an investment from someone who's new to the field, either a super angel or a tech investor, then I question, well, why aren't the people who really know how this all plays out, why aren't they investing? So that's where you really want, and that may be great for you at the beginning where you have, low dilution, you get a lot of capital, but longer term, as things play out, wow, this took longer than the tech investor thought, or this was harder because they haven't necessarily experienced those life cycles and the challenges of regulation or getting paid. And so you really want to have a mix. Now, that being said, if you're in spaces like me, where you have both med device and machine learning. Like I had Third Rock, which is primarily a life science firm, but Google Ventures, which brought other things to bear, and also Deep Pockets too. So there are ways to mix the two where you can get value from both. But I think in anything healthcare related, you really do want some investors around the table who understand the ups and downs, because invariably things take longer and cost more than you anticipate. And you want investors who've seen that cycle and know that's just where that way it is, and will be there in case you need more, because it just took longer. I've seen a lot of companies go under because they didn't have that alignment of what they initial investors thought they were investing in versus where the company really is in the history of a life cycle of a med device company or a healthcare company.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. I mean, and yeah, I think that advice is certainly appreciated, especially in such an opaque thing as fundraising. Yeah, absolutely. So I think what might be make sense to move into now is, of course, if anybody sort of has any questions, feel free to either drop them in the chat, raise your hand, whatever you want to do. I'll then call on you. But if not, I'm curious if you could reflect on what are the most enjoyable and not enjoyable or least fun parts of your job, both as a founder, but also as a founder in the healthcare space specifically.
Yeah, so I think in the healthcare space, the best thing is ultimately if you can get your product to people, it has an intangible benefit. But I mean, it has a benefit that's it's more than just money or anything. If there's an intangible like quality to it, which gives satisfaction. I mean, that's the reason why anyone should take these journeys in healthcare companies, because they're long and hard. They're very challenging and tough, but the payoff is when that patient helps you. And I can tell you, all the engineers we had at iRhythm, when they're able to say that, our product's been used on millions of people for real and helping them find arrhythmias and get them treated, that's really meaningful. And again, when you also look at all the different things smart people like yourselves and here in the Bay Area can work on, I wish I could harness more power to come into healthcare, digital, like other things versus some of the other places people go. Not as a value judgment, it's just that, long term, the things that the people work on healthcare can have a benefit that transcends your time there. So I think that's the best part about working in healthcare, and particularly founding something in healthcare. I think the hard part is no different than any other company. People, hiring good people, retaining good people, managing people, personalities, different types of, in my world, every type of engineer, because we're building complex electrical mechanical product, mechanical firmware, hardware, algorithm, data. There's a gazillion different types of people, clinical manufacturing. So managing all those personalities, how do you build a culture to pull it all together? If any CEO ever tells you that their number one job is not managing people, they're not focused on the right thing. It's literally, but that's also rewarding, but also somewhat draining at times because it's a lot of work. Those are, again, those are pretty straightforward, basic things. Obviously, there's a lot of other benefits in terms of if things go well. Some of the best things, like, when we went public on NASDAQ in 2016, that was a surreal experience to kind of like be there and be part of that. And it's kind of like, it's literally, I'm an American, but I was born in India. I moved here when I was 3, but that's kind of like an immigrant. Like you can't write it better than that. Like, oh, we're going public. Yeah, exactly. It's really exciting. Particularly when you're also going public, at least in that, where the capital is used to accelerate growth of the product, get it to more people, enable access. So I think those are all benefits, but those shouldn't be what drive you. What should drive you is like, how do I get this to patients, at least in the healthcare field? Or even if you're not in the healthcare field, how can what I do really solve this problem that will, bring joy to people, depending on what you're doing, or, fix this inefficiency or whatever it might be. Because if that's not the core driver, it's very difficult to, the hopes of going public or making a lot of money it's a 99% luck. Right time, right place.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think Wei had a question. Wei, if you want to introduce yourself to Uday as well, that'd be great.
Yes, absolutely. My name is Wei Escala. Uday, thank you so much for coming in and share your insights with us. So our company work in a fertility and cryogenic preservation space. So 1 in 8 couples in the US have difficulty conceiving. So we are providing a cloud-based solution to help inventory managing, tracking, and matching, doctors, clinics, and biospecimens between recipients and donors. So I really like, what you said about like you would love to get feedback on, why your company can work and why your company cannot work. So I was just wondering, can I, follow up with you after this? And, is this a field that you could potentially, give us some feedback on?
Sure, maybe not the field as much. I don't know as much about the fertility space, though I will say that in my role at Stanford, I do a lot of DEI and equity work, and I sit on a board of a company that's that's building a device that's focused on vaginal atrophy for postmenopausal women. And there's another company I'm thinking about that's developing a new type of tampon. It's really more of an equity play because of wearables and usables, really. Yeah. And then as an entrepreneur founding company, so I'm happy to, give you any advice, but don't know much about the fertility space off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's no problem. I think a fresh perspective might be even better, right? You might behave like a VC, so that might be a very good perspective. I appreciate it. Thank you. I'll follow up with you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Amazing. Are there any other questions before I jump back in? Sounds good. We'll go back to the the list then. Yeah, so I appreciate that sentiment. I'm curious. So if you had to give advice, I know all you've sort of done is give advice so far, but no, if you had to specifically give advice to university founders, so founders either specifically perhaps in their undergrad years, thinking about especially in the healthcare space, oh, do I go to med school? Do I just like found something right out of undergrad? How do I make that decision? What do you tell them? And how do you sort of frame that advice in your career and things that you have experienced?
Again, I think it depends on who you are as a person, and then kind of how well you know yourself. I feel like this is like Lion King and Rafiki. Do you know who you are? It's like like it's really important to think about this. Undergrad years they go by super quick, and you do a lot of things. So I would say a couple of things. I would say, though I took a lot of classes, I wish I had taken even more humanity classes than I did. I took a lot. I think in whatever career you take, humanism, like really understanding the arts, really understanding social sciences, is very critical because most organizations today really value how you play well, how you work with others, how you understand others, how you think about the world. And it's so even in engineering or science or medicine, I think those skills are very, 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 very important. I can tell you, I still remember, I took a lot of science classes, but the class I remember most, or senior year, I took Michelangelo for, it was one of my favorite classes, and then I went to Florence, or I took a whole class on World War II, or I took, Shakespeare, the early plays. I don't know if they still have all those courses still, but yeah, these are all things that I really remember, though I remember a lot of science too, but not the details versus those things. And so something like have a broad experience. Harvard's a unique place to basically be able to take all sorts of things, because that will help you. Why is that important? Because that will help you understand yourself, and not do you want to start a company, not do you want to go to med school, but why do you want to do whatever? Like what is your goal? Not the how you do it, but the why. Like, and it could include like, well, I really like to experience new cultures and travel. Okay, well, that's great. Then you should. To some degree. I mean, again, life starts and then, you can't take off forever. That's a different issue. But trying to use the years in undergrad to explore different things. Like I said, is it take a summer abroad? I wish I had. I didn't do that. That's something that I tell my kids who are still in middle and elementary school, like they should definitely do. Or like I said, or try to do something with your, to understand what does it mean to be an entrepreneur. Are there things you can get experience with, not just taking classes? I used to laugh at my business school friends who used to take classes on entrepreneurship. I was like, how's that going? I mean, you got to do it. You got to try it. You got to see it. It's not the same as learning it from a book. So I would say, like, really learn about who you are, what do you like, and you might be surprised if you, again, to borrow a page from my my kid's book, like really have a growth mindset about what you're learning, and don't go in like, I must do this. This is what this is my only idea. You just never know where you might find inspiration or learn a little bit more about yourself, so that by the time you get to junior and senior year, when you're looking about what to do, whether it's med school, like you should go to med school because you want to help patients. Now, there are many ways to help patients. Like I sometimes I don't practice anymore because I can't do so many things, and you don't want doctors who do it for a hobby. You want people who really, especially do procedures. But I think all of that work was very important in how I build companies and how I put the patient first, and where it was very, very important in terms of, and now I have a scalability of what I've been able to do in terms of the number of people, things I've worked on have helped. So, and like I said, Harvard is a very rich environment, not only for opportunities, but because of the Boston area. And you'll be surprised. So I used to live in Cabot House. That's where my house was. But I had a car because I used to go to Mass General East. But I used to go clubbing a lot, 3 times a week, actually, for all of junior, senior year. And so most of my friends were from BC and BU, because most Harvard people never left their house. But I had a great time meeting a lot of different people, a lot of international students who were part of that club scene. I used to be on New Ridge Street a lot, and so you could say I was goofing off, but I actually learned a lot from those experiences that were very instrumental in helping me think about diversity, thinking about my own companies, thinking about how to build teams. So that's why I think that, the more you can not have an insular experience, the more likely you'll be able to put things, again, it's data. It goes back to what I said at the beginning. These are all data points that you can use as you determine like what is the best pathway for you. And you should also remember that you may not be ready to found a company right out of school, but that doesn't mean you can't found a company. You really need to think about when is the match of luck, macro trends, your career, your idea, they all match up. And it might happen after you go work for a few years, learn what the work world is like. So there's no right pathway. It's just more about how much more can you learn about your own strengths and weaknesses, your own inclinations. And again, I'd warrant that most people you have don't talk about these things typically to entrepreneurs, but as a mentor to many of my fellows in the Stanford Biodesign program who are doctors, business people, engineers, these are the things that matters. Because before you know it, you'll be in your 30s too. You might have kids, you may have a partner, you'll have a mortgage. Life will hit you in the face. So you just want to make sure, and those things don't stop. Those just be, so the more, not to get worried about it, but just the big picture, like where do you want to be in 5 or 10 years? What will make you happy? What do you really want to accomplish? And if it's all about monetary, you should go to banking or do something else. So anyways, hopefully that was a little waxing a little bit nostalgic, but I do think those are things, that were important to me, when I was an undergrad.
Yeah, I mean, I think I personally really appreciate that because I'm actually rather involved in the humanities on campus, and I know, this is certainly not something you hear to sort of go out and club and party very often. So,
well, yeah, I mean, there's a balance, but I'm saying like those were experiences that were very valuable, because I expanded my horizons outside of Harvard. I really met a lot of different students who brought different strengths and different way of looking at the world, different career aspirations, but we had something in common. And so the point of that story was more like there's always opportunities to learn from all different types of people, all different settings. And so as long as you approach it that way, and I don't think I intentionally approached it that way, I was just that type of a person. But now in hindsight, I think, because I sometimes like, why did I get lucky? Like, how did I get to this point? Why am I so fortunate? Part of it's me, but most of it's partly like in my company, we'll be successful not because of me. I mean, I just put the pieces together, but it's a lot of smarter people than me in the company who are really the real reason why these things have been successful.
Yeah, yeah. I guess that's an interesting thing to that I like to harken on. Just the sort of, and I know you alluded to this earlier, that running a company, being a CEO is a people management job, right? How do you think? I don't know how to phrase this, but how do you think the importance of people management shifts from, as a company scales? And more specifically, like what are you sort of focusing on as most right now in your role as CEO?
Yeah. So it's a good point. So I think sometimes people have a fallacy that the culture never changes. So I'm not sure I would agree with that. I think the foundational principles of what you're building are important, but the way it gets manifest and implemented change. So when you're a 4-person, 5-person, 10-person team, is it like we're 60 people now, we're going to 100 people and we'll get bigger. So all of those things are like different. Like managing 60 is different managing 100, managing 1,000 versus managing 5. But if your principles or your values of transparency or integrity, whatever you care about, those are still there. And so part of the thing is, how do you not get stuck on being a certain way, the how, but how do you make sure that for the company and its size and the mix of people, those principles are implemented that makes the sense for that stage. And so it changes. So oftentimes as companies get bigger, there's more policies, there's more, I wouldn't say red tape, but there's more process. You try to work nimbly, but maybe there's a little bit something that's different. And so it's really managing, how do you also manage old people who've been there a long time and new people? Like, so, and then also the fact of the matter is, the Bay Area, if you have not watched it, you should, and if you ever think about the Bay Area, there's a good PBS American Experience show about the history of this place, about how kind of the semiconductor industry was born here, how Shockley and some of the people from Bell Labs came here, but basically created a culture where you could reinvent yourself every 4 years. So people, that was not heard of before then in the early 20th century, where people would go to work for one company, and that's where they worked. Now you could come here and people could go and work at a company and then leave and start competing companies. And that's how Noyce and Intel came about. So it's this idea that's in the DNA, at least around here in the Bay Area, that, I always find it surprising. Like I myself probably won't work at a given company, even my own company, more than 6, 7 years, 8 years. I mean, even that's a long time. Most people cycle after 4 or 5 nowadays. And so you should try to think about, as you're thinking about employees, or I am, I don't expect them to be here forever, but how do I make sure that the 4 or 5 years they're here, they have a really good experience, they get professional growth. One of the hardest challenges that's been for any CEO of Gen X like me in dealing with the next gen, and millennials and Gen Z, is getting people to understand there's a timeline of how it's not just what you do. You have to see things, you have to have battle scars, and there's a value to that. And so getting people to understand, like, part of my responsibility is to make sure that the people I hire, they kind of get skills and they get training and they understand you don't just get a gold star for doing something in 6 months. No, you get for meeting challenges. And so that'll put them in a better position 10 years from now when they're trying to compete with other people to be managers or directors, because everyone can't be a director or a VP. But, so there's a level of professionalism that's important to find. So I would also say young entrepreneurs, or young people looking for jobs, I can't tell you how many look at only the money. The number one thing you should look at is, like, who are the people you're going to work with? Are they going to take care of you? Are they going to think about your future? Are they going to think about your career path? I could tell you, like, we've lost people who have focused on the wrong side. Well, I could go work for Google. Then I'm like, you should go work for Google. If you want to be in a startup and like learn how this works, we can't pay you like Google, because if we could pay you like Google and we're a startup, why would anyone work at Google? Like, just work here. But that's not how it works. And so you got to figure out, what do you value? Like, again, no one's saying like go work for like nothing or anything, but really trying to make choices about not the near term, but the long term, because you're going to spend more than half your life at your job. And so who you work with, how they're thinking about you, and thinking about your career, and mentoring you is something that I don't think enough of your mentors mentor you enough about the value of that. Not just the name, it's just like really thinking about, who am I going to work with? Does this person really, do I think they'll care about?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that's super interesting. I mean,
well, because at Harvard, like it's Harvard. Like, I was there. I mean, I get it. Like, everyone's really good and really smart, so you should know what to do. But people don't teach or really think about investing in. I remember when I was in med school too. When I wanted to go start companies in the late 90s in medicine, that was like, what are you doing? Why don't you go get a research grant and go to a lab? You're a smart guy. No. I want to go do device development. People didn't understand it. And it's not wrong or right, but it's important to also find mentors at your stage who are not asking you why you don't like the things that they like, but really asking you, what do you like? And maybe they can't help you, but at least they can point you in a direction, be like, okay, I'm not the person to help you, but seems like you're really passionate about that. Why don't you go talk to these other people or something like that? That's one of the big pet peeves I have with mentorship in academics. It sometimes feels more about the mentor than the mentee.
Very interesting. Yeah, Asher, I think you had a question. If you want to unmute and ask it. If
Yeah,
not.
sure.
Okay.
I guess, hi, Uday. Thanks for coming. I guess my question's related to culture and values. I mean, Huck P has its own culture and values, and we're thinking about how we want to maybe change those going forward, or think about creating them so that as we scale from maybe like a 50 to 100 to 200 person organization, there can be some consistency between years. And so, yeah, I'm just wondering, what do you think about how startups think about creating a culture, defining its values, and generally like having an identity for itself that will last a long time and be productive?
And you're talking about your organization now, or?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, how big are you now?
I think we're about 100, 120 people.
So you're already kind of, so, but you're not, again, you're talking about this organization. Yeah. So this is a harder one because it's not like, this is not your job. I mean, this is it's, I assume, more like a thing you do in addition to your, everything else you do.
Yeah.
So it's a little harder. I mean, in a normal organization, you really want to understand, well, hopefully you don't get to 120 and don't know who you are. Like, hopefully you're trying to, early on, you kind of figure out, like, what is your goal? What do you hope to accomplish? Is it more like for this, is it networking? Is it funding? Is it like, what is it? Connecting with Harvard? I don't know. I mean, so you should think about what are the things that enable that? Is it, and has that been codified somewhere at some point? Because again, whether you're 100 or 150, for things like this, no, it does scale. Like if you're trying to also give grants to everybody, it gets really hard if you're 200 people versus 20, or like or is it more, what was I going to say? If it's less about fundraising, it's more about learning and like things like this, then I think it could be universal. So I think if you haven't codified your values, you really should figure out who are the people who've been part of this organization since the beginning, who have really, like, why did it start? Like, what was the need that was seen? That need for why an organization like this was required, that should be the basis of like, well, what are our values if we're trying to solve this problem? And if that problem has been solved, then you may need to adapt. What is our new focus area? What is our expanded focus area? What are the things that enable us to achieve that? Is it transparency? Is it, accessibility to getting to lots of different people? I can tell you at Stanford Biodesign, we're also doing a lot of deep work right now on kind of in racial equity, even of our program across the university. And it's amazing how even within a place like Stanford in the Bay Area, there's just so many like built-in biases and other things that we want to break down. So what are those things that are important to you as you get bigger and people get to know you? So I can't tell you exactly without knowing kind of like what your things are, but I would warrant that you probably have some, if you could articulate your values related to your original need, I would say that probably some of those still apply. But as you get larger in scope and you attract new people, you should really listen to, are they still resonating with your original need, or are they coming and joining because of some other issue or some other need? And then do you have to expand or morph how you live by these values? Does that make sense? I know it's a little bit vague.
Yeah, no, that I mean, of course, a lot of these things are somewhat vague, and we speak in generalities, but I think that is helpful today. So thank you for that.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't know more about the background of your organization so much. We never had any of this stuff when I was there. Well, we didn't.
Oh no.
We didn't have really the internet. I mean, it's easy. It's like we did, but not Zoom.
Yeah, no worries. Definitely something that I think I'm definitely in agreement with Asher that we're sort of at this point where we're a couple years old, still a relatively young organization, and really seeking to define what is it that, I mean, we sort of know what it is that sort of drove our initial growth and obviously got us kicked off the ground, but now it's a question of what happens next, right? Like we have this, we have our value add, but how do we scale that and how do we do it in a way that preserves sort of what we're originally intending. But yeah, no, I would definitely appreciate that. Yeah, I guess so. Sort of going back to what you were saying earlier about sort of people. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on location in
Yeah.
terms of founding, a company. And I know in the very early minutes of the chat, you alluded to the sort of probabilities notion
Yeah.
and sort of the Bay Area having more of that. But I'm curious, I guess, both for founders in general and for healthcare. The big question is the Bay Area still at the thing that it always has been in light of COVID? And
Yeah.
if you have any sort of thoughts there.
Yeah. So I think, like I said, put the industry aside. I think the first thing to think about is today, not where more companies have jobs, but where are more innovative ideas still coming from? Now, maybe there was a little bit more of a monopoly in the past, and maybe now it's spreading a little bit. But I would still say San Francisco, the Bay Area, San Diego, Boston, Minneapolis, Austin, Triangle Park. There's a few places, Seattle, which are still very important. Just because Salesforce or Facebook or other putting offices elsewhere, they're not necessarily inventing new things there. They're putting a lot of their workforce there. Not to say that those workforces aren't going to innovate too, of course, but there is something to be said about if you're starting from scratch, all of the ancillary services, IP lawyers, corporate attorneys, like, funding firms, those haven't changed. Those are still in New York, Boston, San Francisco. That's just where they are. And so it's very different when you think about large companies, innovation, and startup, like you as a person. But now there may be some more opportunities to start, like if you're into digital health, maybe New York, parts of New York are pretty interesting. Or maybe, or if you're in biotech, clearly, Kendall Square and, Boston, here, South San Francisco, crazy. A lot of the growth here is all in biotech, even though biotech's always been big here, but it's growing like crazy as well. So you just have to start looking around about where are new companies being formed in your area, not necessarily where innovative companies are. That might be a product of something different. And so I would still posit that things are important here. Now, that being said, let's say you're interested in the automotive industry, or you're interested in farm tech, let's just say ag tech. Maybe the middle of the country, like Iowa or like Michigan, could be places where you go and understand problems, but you may still have to figure out how to coordinate with places which have funding. But like, again, Chicago has a lot of funding, has VCs as well. So you have to think there's a regional element to it as well. I used to talk a lot at different universities. People's like, well, how can we be like Stanford? I said, why do you want to be like Stanford? You have different strengths. Like Hopkins, you have an amazing public health school. Michigan, you have this automotive industry and automotive suppliers. I mean, you have people here who can make a lot of things in a way that other parts. I'm a strong believer in America, but not to compete with itself, to like take the best of different parts to figure out like how do we enable that. Like I remember going to Iowa City for a talk at the university there, and I didn't realize how far advanced autonomous vehicles are in the farm industry, well before the automotive industry. So, who would have known? I mean, obviously people know that, but again, unless you open your eyes and start thinking about these, like there are innovations happening in a lot of different places depending on the area. So that's why I would say that for me in health tech, the Bay Area was correct in the mid 2000s, still is. But for you, if you have ideas or solving problems in other industries, be open-minded to understand where is that happening, where can you learn. Now, that doesn't mean it won't be hard if there's just not a lot of other people like you, but it may give you insights which give you a leg up. So that's what, but there are a lot of great places to innovate around this country.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, especially in terms of ag tech, I feel like that's certainly an underestimated area,
Totally.
especially in the Bay, if you will.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, so I mean, I have like one last question for you, Uday, but before we get there, if anybody has any questions they want to ask, this probably is your last chance.
You can always follow up later. I mean, I get inbounds. So I get inbounds from all sorts of students everywhere all the time. One thing, I will respond to you. That's one thing I hated about academics too, just not taking students seriously or just ignoring them. I may not be able to help you, but at least I'll acknowledge and say like, hey, okay, here's where. And so I think, yeah, if there's anything comes up later, I'm sure Nathan, you can follow up with, me or whomever.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, feel free to email
Like
us.
I'd never heard of your organization when you emailed me, but I was like, oh, I'll look it up. I'll check it out.
Yeah, well, we're glad that you're here. So, yeah, awesome. Yeah. So my last question is super simple. What are your biggest regrets?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think a couple things. I kind of alluded to one. I wish I had, while I had a great time in college and I learned a lot, I wish I had maybe changed the mix of things I took. I took probably 75-25 science to humanities, took things, my entire senior year was basically at the med school, which was great. I learned a lot, but I wish I'd done more 60-40, really balanced it more, because those are the types of classes that in hindsight, I was probably too, I started Harvard when I just turned 17, so I was really young. And so I think not maturity, just that I didn't have kind of a lot of people telling me like, oh, you should really look broadly and do other things. And when you're a biochem major, it's competitive. I'm still sure it's competitive as a biochem major these days. I don't think that's changed. So one, yeah, have a broader perspective earlier in your career. Definitely, the world is super small now, but don't live it on a screen. An Instagram shot is not the same as the place. Or one of the things I always encourage here at the work is, the point of we've been back at work for the last 6 months as an essential business in San Francisco, but that ability to collaborate and be in front of other people, I can tell you that I've definitely, one of the things we saw, I ran our India and Singapore programs at Stanford Biodesign. The number one predictor of success was the ability for our fellows, their ability to communicate in written and spoken language. If they did that well, they had a much higher probability of going far. And then if you layer on being professional and all those other things, I mean, I've told this story before at iRhythm. Some people used to ask me when I used to give talks, so what was it? And I was like, look, I'm nice. When people ask me a question, I'll answer it back. You cannot underestimate how far being nice will get you. And you can't be fake about it if you're an asshole. But if you're nice, if you really are, it really goes far. So I think there's just simple things your mom taught you probably that actually get you very far in life, if you're that type of person. So I think in terms of just going back to the regrets, like expanding my horizons even more in terms of what I learned. I think traveling more. I traveled a lot with my family, and I travel a lot now, but more kind of from an exploratory standpoint. And then kind of later, I don't get to practice seeing patients anymore. That's a regret, but you have to pick and choose what your day job is. I think that's the other thing. A lot of young people want optionality, like keep all the options open. And sometimes you got to grow up and make the choice, and call an audible, and it's got to do it. Because life moves, one of my favorite movie of all time is Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Life moves pretty fast, and if you don't stop and look around, you could miss it. So, take it for all you have. So I would say not being able to see patients, but that was the right choice at the time. And now I look back and say, I'm no longer a physician entrepreneur. I'm an entrepreneur who happens to be a physician. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good of a note as any to end on. So yeah, just wanted to say thank you so much for being here, Uday.
Yeah.
I really appreciated the conversation. I thought it was a great one. If it's all right with you, we'll probably.
Yeah, I think this turned out to be more philosophical than about entrepreneurship, but I can tell you these are the things that actually differentiate successful from unsuccessful in general. Not all.
Yeah.
There's some very famous people who are not good people who are very successful. So it's not a generality, but.
Absolutely. I mean, I for one appreciate the philosophical. So yeah, thanks so much, Uday.
All right,
Thanks
talk to you guys
for
later.
coming.
Yeah.
And,
Thank you.
Yeah. All right.
all right,
Bye.
bye.